In 1869, on a private farm just outside Paris, a French chemist named Hippolyte Mège-Mouriès stood over a vat of melted beef fat and skimmed milk, trying to win an argument with an emperor. The emperor was Napoleon III, nephew of the more famous Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had a problem that no army and no treasury could fix directly. Butter was running out. France under the Second Empire was industrializing fast. Farmers were leaving the countryside for factory jobs in the cities, and the cows that once produced surplus cream for every village went with them, or simply stopped being milked at the old scale. Butter prices climbed. The poor could no longer afford it, and the French Navy, which needed a stable, long-lasting fat to feed sailors on months-long voyages, could not get enough of it either. Real butter spoiled fast in the heat of a ship's hold. Real butter cost real money that a government feeding an army and a fleet did not have to spare. So Napoleon III did what emperors do when a problem cannot be solved by decree. He offered a prize, roughly equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today, to any chemist who could invent a cheap, long-lasting substitute for butter, something fit for his poorer subjects and his sailors alike. Mège-Mouriès took the challenge personally. He had already won the Legion of Honor from the same emperor years earlier for work on bread. Now he turned his attention to fat itself, to the strange chemistry of how a cow's body turns feed into cream in the first place. He theorized, incorrectly as it turned out, that cows produced milk fat by reabsorbing their own body fat and reprocessing it. So he tried to copy that process by hand. He rendered beef tallow, churned it with skimmed milk, added salt, and, according to several historical accounts, a touch of material drawn from a pig's stomach lining, an attempt to replicate the enzymes a cow's body would naturally use. The result was a pale, waxy substance, more like a firm jelly than the smooth spread we know now. He named it Margarine after the Greek word for pearl because the fat crystals inside it shimmered like tiny beads. On July 15, 1869, the French government granted him a 15-year patent. He had won the Emperor's Prize. He had built the world's first successful lab-grown food. And it changed almost nothing, at least not right away. The market did not care that an emperor liked it. The public was suspicious, the taste was off, and Napoleon III himself would not live to see his invention succeed. Barely a year after the patent was granted, France went to war with Prussia. The war went badly. The emperor was captured at the Battle of Sedan, and the Second Empire collapsed within months. The man who ordered fake butter into existence never got to see what it would become. That did not stop the invention, it just delayed it. Here is the part that should surprise you. That awkward beef fat jelly from a French farm outside Paris would go on to trigger one of the strangest legal wars in the history of food. A decades-long fight so absurd that entire American states passed laws demanding it be dyed pink so that no one could mistake it for the real thing. Grown men went to prison for selling the wrong color of spread. Sneaking a stick of yellow margarine across a state line was, for a while, treated with the same suspicion as smuggling contraband liquor. And it did not stop there. In one Canadian province, this fight over the color of a breakfast spread did not end until the year 2008, well within the memory of most adults alive today. So how did a jar of beef fat, invented to solve a wartime butter shortage in 19th century France, end up as one of the most bitterly regulated, politically fought-over foods in modern history? How did a product literally engineered in a lab become, within a single lifetime, cheaper, more common, and in some countries, more consumed than the real butter it was built to replace? That story does not really begin in 1869 either. To understand why an emperor needed to invent fake butter, you first have to understand why real butter mattered so much in the first place. And that story starts thousands of years earlier, in the pastoral grasslands of the ancient world, long before France, long before Rome, long before anyone had a word for margarine at all. Archaeologists have found the residue of dairy fat on pottery shards from the Fertile Crescent dating back roughly 8,000 years. Somewhere among early cattle and sheep herders, someone discovered that if you agitate cream long enough, in a skin bag, in a wooden churn, even in a hollowed gourd slung on the back of a camel during a long journey, the fat molecules clump together and separate from the liquid. Butter was, in a very real sense, the world's first accidental biotechnology. Nobody understood the chemistry. Nobody knew what an emulsion was. They just knew that milk, left to slosh around long enough, became something richer, something that kept longer, something that could be traded, stored, and rationed through a hard winter. In a world without refrigeration, that was not a luxury. It was survival. Ancient civilizations treated butter with something close to reverence. In India, clarified butter, known as ghee, became sacred, used in temple rituals and offered to the gods, a practice that continues in some Hindu traditions to this day. In ancient Ireland and Scotland, farmers buried wooden casks of butter deep in peat bogs, sometimes for years, allowing it to age and ferment underground, the way a modern chef might age cheese. Archaeologists still occasionally dig up these so-called bog butters, centuries-old blocks of preserved fat, remarkably intact in the cold, oxygen-starved peat. The Vikings churned butter for long sea voyages. Tibetan monks mixed it with tea for warmth and calories at extreme altitude. Butter was currency, medicine, offering, and fuel all at once. Not bad for something that starts as spoiled cream. But here's the thing about butter that made it fragile as an economic product for thousands of years afterward. It required cows, and cows required grass, and grass required land, and land required labor. Butter production could not simply scale up the way grain or salt could. A drought, a disease outbreak among cattle, or a sudden migration of farm labor towards cities could crash the supply overnight. That vulnerability sat quietly in the background of European history for centuries, a slow-ticking problem nobody had urgently solved, because nobody had needed to. Until the 19th century arrived and changed everything about how people lived, worked, and ate. The Industrial Revolution pulled millions of Europeans off farms and into factory cities almost within a single generation. London, Paris, Berlin, and a dozen other capitals swelled with workers who no longer had access to a cow down the road or a neighbor who churned. Demand for dairy fat in cities skyrocketed at exactly the moment that dairy farming, tied to rural land and rural labor, could not keep pace. This is the slow-motion crisis that was already unfolding across France by the time Napoleon III sat down to think about his navy's rations and his poorer subjects' grocery bills. Butter had not gotten worse. There simply was not enough of it to go around, and the price reflected that scarcity brutally. This is where Mège-Mouriès enters the story again, this time not as a curiosity, but as a man solving a genuinely urgent economic problem with the tools of modern chemistry. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the fight over fake butter is about to get considerably stranger. Mège-Mouriès's patent sat quietly for about 2 years after 1869. Mostly unnoticed outside France, until a Dutch businessman named Jan Jurgens traveled to Paris in June of 1871 to see the invention for himself. Jurgens ran a modest trading company in the Netherlands, and he recognized something Mège-Mouriès himself never fully capitalized on. This was not just a wartime ration substitute, it was potentially a mass consumer product. Jurgens bought the rights, brought the process home to the Dutch town of Oss, and began refining it. His company improved the texture, improved the taste, and crucially, began coloring the naturally pale, almost gray substance a warm, buttery yellow, so it would look appetizing on a plate rather than like candle wax. A rival Dutch company run by the Vandenberg family saw the same opportunity and entered the same business. These two competitors would eventually merge decades later, and that merged company would go on to combine with a British soap manufacturer called Lever Brothers to form one of the largest consumer goods corporations on Earth, Unilever. Think about that for a second. One of the biggest companies in the modern world traces a direct thread back to an emperor's wartime butter shortage and a French chemist's beef fat jelly. Meanwhile, Hippolyte Mège-Mouriès himself did not share in that fortune. Despite inventing the process that would eventually be worth untold billions of dollars globally, he profited very little from it directly. He died in 1880 at the age of 62 in relatively modest circumstances. The man who invented one of the most consequential foods of the modern era did not get rich off it. The Dutch traders who refined and marketed it did. That is not a footnote. That is basically the entire pattern of industrial food history in miniature. The inventor solves the problem, and someone else further down the supply chain captures the reward. By the 1870s, margarine had crossed the Atlantic and landed in the United States, where it walked directly into a fight it did not know it was starting. American dairy farmers reacted to margarine with something close to genuine horror. It was cheaper than butter, it kept longer than butter, and thanks to the same yellow coloring trick the Dutch had pioneered, it looked almost exactly like butter sitting on a store shelf. Within roughly a decade of arriving in America, 37 separate margarine companies had sprung up to manufacture and sell it. That kind of rapid growth terrified an entire industry, and dairy farmers did not sit quietly and watch their market share evaporate. They organized, they lobbied, and what followed was not a polite disagreement between competing food producers. It was closer to open legislative war. The dairy lobby's opening argument against margarine was rarely subtle and rarely accurate. Newspapers of the era ran stories claiming margarine was manufactured under filthy, unsanitary conditions, made from diseased animal fat, laced with dangerous chemicals, essentially unfit for human consumption. Much of this was exaggeration or outright fabrication, spread deliberately to frighten consumers away from a cheaper competitor. It worked. By 1886, 20 states had passed laws regulating how margarine could be labeled, and 7 states had banned it outright. That same year, Congress passed the Federal Oleomargarine Act, slapping a steep tax on every pound manufactured, alongside expensive annual licensing fees for manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers. One congressman from Wisconsin, a state that would go on to become one of margarine's most hostile battlegrounds, put the goal in blunt terms on the floor of the House. He wanted a tax high enough to, in his words, utterly destroy the manufacture of counterfeit butter the same way the government would destroy counterfeit currency. This was not about protecting consumers from a dangerous product. It was an economic turf war dressed up as a public health concern. Here is the twist. None of that legislative pressure actually killed margarine. Manufacturers kept producing it, kept dyeing it yellow to compete visually with butter on grocery shelves, and kept finding ways around every new law the dairy lobby pushed through. So the dairy industry escalated. If margarine could not be banned outright, it could at least be made to look as unappetizing as possible. This is where the story gets genuinely bizarre. Several states decided that if margarine could not be prevented from existing, it could at least be prevented from looking like butter. Lawmakers in Vermont, New Hampshire, and South Dakota passed statutes requiring manufacturers to dye their margarine bright pink. Not white, not off-white, pink. Deliberately, unmistakably, unappetizingly pink, so that no shopper could possibly confuse it with real butter sitting on the same shelf. In New Hampshire, selling margarine that was not pink could get you fined $100 or land you in prison for up to 60 days. 60 days in prison for selling the wrong colored spread. That sounds almost too strange to be real. It is real. It was a genuine law enforced by real courts against real grocers in real American states. The pink laws did not survive long. In 1898, the United States Supreme Court struck them down, ruling that forcing margarine to be an unappetizing color effectively destroyed the manufacturer's ability to sell a legal product at all. The court's language was almost dryly amused about it, noting that pink is not in fact the natural color of oleomargarine, and that dyeing it that way existed for one purpose only: to disgust the customer before they ever tasted it. Losing the pink laws did not end the fight. It just redirected it. In 1902, Congress amended the original Oleomargarine Act and created a new tax structure. Uncolored, natural-looking margarine, that pale, unappetizing off-white shade, would be taxed at roughly 1/4 of 1 cent per pound. But margarine dyed yellow to resemble butter would be taxed at 10 cents per pound, a fee roughly 40 times higher. Manufacturers were technically free to color their product, they just could not afford to. This was not a ban. It was a ban wearing the disguise of a tax bracket. Margarine companies, to their credit, found a workaround almost immediately. And it is one of the strangest kitchen rituals in American culinary history. Rather than selling pre-colored margarine and eating the punishing tax, companies began packaging their white margarine with a small, separate capsule of yellow food coloring tucked inside the bag. It was entirely legal because the manufacturer had not colored anything. The consumer had. Families across the country would bring home a plain white brick of margarine, break open the little dye capsule, and knead it directly into the fat with their bare hands, sometimes for 20 minutes at a stretch, working the color through by hand until the whole thing looked convincingly buttery. This became a routine kitchen chore in millions of American households, one that persisted well into the middle of the 20th century. An entire generation of children grew up literally massaging yellow dye into their family's breakfast spread because of a tax law written to protect the dairy industry. Then came a development that the dairy lobby never saw coming, and it had nothing to do with lawsuits or legislation. It had to do with a world war and a rationing crisis, and it is the moment margarine finally, permanently overtook the product it had been created to imitate. During the Second World War, real butter became scarce across much of the industrialized world, rationed tightly to feed troops and demanded strained agricultural supply chains. Margarine, cheaper to produce and less dependent on dairy herds, filled the gap in millions of households almost overnight. People who had never bought margarine before suddenly had no other option, and by the time the war ended and rationing eased, an entire generation had simply gotten used to it. Consumption habits, once formed under necessity, tend to stick. In the United States, margarine consumption climbed steadily through the post-war decades, and by the late 1950s, Americans were, for the first time in the product's history, eating more margarine than butter. The very product the dairy industry had spent 70 years trying to legislate out of existence had quietly, almost without anyone declaring a winner, become the more common spread in the American kitchen. Before we go further, it is worth pausing on the science that made this entire scaled-up industry even possible. Because without one specific German chemist, margarine would never have become cheap enough or stable enough to dominate a global market the way it eventually did. In 1901, a chemist in Germany named Wilhelm Normann discovered a process for hydrogenating liquid vegetable oils, essentially bubbling hydrogen gas through hot oil in the presence of a metal catalyst, chemically converting a liquid fat into a solid one. He patented the process in 1902. This mattered enormously because up until that point, margarine relied heavily on animal fats like beef tallow, the same basic formula Mège-Mouriès had started with decades earlier. Hydrogenation meant manufacturers could take cheap, abundant plant oils, soybean, cottonseed, palm, and chemically harden them into a spreadable solid without needing a single cow. By 1909, a commercial hydrogenation plant in England was already producing roughly 3,000 tons of hardened fat a year. The technology spread fast, licensed by companies across Europe, and eventually acquired in America by Procter & Gamble, who used the same hydrogenation process to launch a new vegetable shortening in 1911, sold under the brand name Crisco. Margarine and Crisco share the exact same chemical grandparent. Paul Sabatier, whose earlier research on hydrogenation chemistry made Normann's breakthrough possible, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1912 for laying the theoretical groundwork. Hydrogenation is where this story turns dark, though not in the way you might expect from a food this ordinary. Nobody in 1902 understood what hydrogenation was actually doing at the molecular level. Bubbling hydrogen through liquid oil does not just harden the fat cleanly. It also creates a byproduct called trans fatty acids, twisted molecular structures that do not occur in significant quantities anywhere in nature. For most of the 20th century, nobody flagged this as a problem. Trans fats made food shelf-stable, cheap, and consistent, and for decades that was treated as an unambiguous win. It took nearly a century for the medical research to catch up to the chemistry. Studies beginning in the 1990s began linking trans fat consumption directly to elevated bad cholesterol, lowered good cholesterol, and significantly increased risk of heart disease. By some estimates, trans fats were contributing to roughly 30,000 preventable deaths from heart disease every single year in the United States alone. 30,000 deaths from an ingredient nobody had even identified as dangerous for the better part of 100 years. The regulatory response, once it finally came, moved with unusual speed. New York City banned partially hydrogenated oils from restaurant food in 2007, and within 5 years, the average amount of trans fat in a typical New Yorker's restaurant meal dropped from roughly 3 grams to about half a gram. The United States Food and Drug Administration required trans fat to be listed on nutrition labels starting in 2006, and eventually moved to ban partially hydrogenated oils from the food supply entirely, with enforcement completed around 2018. The exact same chemical process that had made margarine cheap, stable, and universal for over a century was, decades later, quietly phased out of it. Modern margarine, the kind sitting in refrigerators today, is produced using entirely different techniques, chemical or enzymatic intraesterification, that harden vegetable oils without generating meaningful trans fat at all. The product survived. The chemistry that built it did not. And here is the part of this story that should genuinely surprise you, because you might assume the pink laws and the color wars were some quaint relic safely buried in the 19th century. They were not. In the Canadian province of Quebec, it was illegal to sell yellow-colored margarine until the year 2008. Not 1898, 2008. Quebec's dairy industry successfully lobbied to keep margarine legally colorless, essentially a pale, lard-like white, for decades after every other jurisdiction in North America had abandoned similar laws. In 2005, provincial agriculture inspectors actually raided grocery stores near Quebec City to seize tubs of yellow margarine that had been accidentally shipped in from outside the province. Unilever, the same corporate descendant of those original Dutch margarine traders from the 1870s, eventually challenged the law in court and lost, with Canada's Supreme Court upholding Quebec's right to regulate the color of a breakfast spread as recently as 1999. The law was not repealed until 2008, after decades of pressure and an interprovincial trade ruling that found it violated Canada's own internal trade agreements. If you are under the age of 20, this legal battle over a spread's color was still active while you were watching cartoons. This is the part that does not get enough credit. The entire absurd century-and-a-half saga of margarine, the pink dye, the yellow capsules, the kneading rituals, the Supreme Court rulings on both sides of the border, was never really about health, and it was never really about taste. It was about protecting one industry's market share from a cheaper competitor by any legal means available, dressed up in whatever justification happened to be politically convenient at the time. Today, margarine has settled into something far less dramatic and far more global than its origin story would suggest. The global margarine market is valued at somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion annually, produced primarily from palm, soybean, sunflower, and rapeseed oils, with plant-based sources now dominating the industry the way beef tallow once did in Mège-Mouriès' original formula. North America and increasingly Asia-Pacific markets account for the largest shares of global consumption, driven heavily not by household toast spreading, but by industrial demand, commercial bakeries, packaged food manufacturers, and the food service industry, where margarine's stability, shelf life, and cost advantage over butter remain exactly as valuable today as they were to a French emperor feeding a navy in 1869. But margarine is far more than just a breakfast spread today, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Modern margarine formulations are engineered for specific functional purposes far beyond taste. Certain margarines are fortified with plant sterols, compounds clinically shown to help lower LDL cholesterol, essentially turning a former dietary villain into a targeted cardiovascular health product. Bakeries rely on specialized margarines with precisely engineered melting points to create the flaky laminated layers in croissants and puff pastry, a texture that is genuinely difficult to replicate with butter alone at industrial scale. Some formulations are fortified with vitamins A and D, added specifically because margarine has, for generations now, functioned as a dietary staple for lower-income households worldwide. Exactly the population Napoleon III originally set out to feed with his prize competition. 150 plus years ago, it was there in a French emperor's failing empire, born from a butter shortage and a chemist's stubborn theory about how cows made cream. It was there in Dutch trading houses that turned one man's patent into a multinational corporation. It was there in American courtrooms arguing over whether pink was cruel and unusual punishment for a grocery item. It was there in the hands of families across an entire continent, kneading yellow dye into a plastic bag at the kitchen table. It was there in the chemistry labs that hardened it, and decades later in the chemistry labs that had to quietly fix what the hardening process had broken. It was there in a Quebec courtroom as recently as this century, still fighting the exact same battle over color that started in 1877 America. And now it is there in your refrigerator, sitting in a plastic tub or a foil-wrapped stick, costing a few dollars, drawing no lawsuits, inspiring no riots, utterly unremarkable. Not bad for a jar of beef fat an emperor ordered up in a hurry because real butter got too expensive. If any part of this surprised you, the pink laws, the Quebec ban, the fact that one of the world's largest corporations basically started as a margarine side hustle, let me know in the comments which detail got you the most. And if you enjoyed digging into the strange hidden history behind something this ordinary, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have a lot more stories like this one coming. I will see you in the next one.